This is lecture for section 3 of chapter 10. We're going to talk about the description of the neuron cell mainly, but also a few other cells just to start to talk about some of the supporting type structures on a typical neuron. Here you can see a picture of a neuron, and a neuron is the basic structural and functional unit of the nervous system. It's the one that does the majority of the work. You have billions of neurons in your brain, spinal cord, and throughout your peripheral nervous system too. They can vary in size. Some of them are quite long, some are quite short, and they vary in shapes. And we'll talk about the different shapes of the multipolar, unipolar, and bipolar shaped neurons in section 4 a little bit later on. But here you can see a typical neuron. This is actually a multipolar neuron with its different body parts, and so we're going to talk specifically in this section about the dendrites. We're going to talk about the soma. We're going to talk about the axon leaving the terminal ends, and then we'll talk about these myelin sheaths. As you take a look here at a few different things, one of the things that you notice is we have these little myelin sheaths in little segments, and then there's a little break in the segment. One thing to keep in mind as we talk a little bit later, coming down the neuron is an electrical impulse that's been created from some sort of stimulation, either in a motor neuron leaving your brain or spinal cord, or an a sensory neuron coming to your brain or spinal cord. So we have an electrical signal. You can sort of think of these myelin sheaths kind of like an insulator on a wire. They're going to keep in that information and insulate that electrical signal. One thing that's unique to the neurons, though, as opposed to just a regular electrical wire, in these things called the nodes of Ranvier, the little spaces that we have, the electrical signal is allowed to skip ahead over these myelin sheaths. And so the more nodes that you have in any particular neuron, the faster that electrical signal is going to be sent. So these little nodes where there's a space like right here where there is no myelin sheath, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later in this segment, that electrical signal can skip or jump ahead. So one thing to keep in mind kind of as we're going along here. Our next slide here just gives us a little bit of information. We're going to start here with the cell body, talking about that. So basically our neuron structure has three major parts. The cell body, often referred to as the soma, dendrites, and axons. And we're going to spend most of our time covering those three parts in this particular segment. So the cell body, that's the main part of the cell, sometimes called the soma, sometimes called the perikaryon. That's the main part of the cell that does its different, takes on its information. And so in this soma, I'll move this up just a little bit for us here. Here's the neuron right here, the whole neuron, and there's the cell body right there, or the soma. So this main structure right here is the soma. Okay, in there you can clearly see the nucleus, which is right there, the nucleolus, which is right there. And then these little green bodies are called Nissl bodies, little chromophilic type structures that are little membrane sacs that have a ribosome. And if you remember from way back when, ribosomes are involved with making proteins and doing various things. And we'll kind of talk about that a little bit later. So there's the soma kind of up close and personal. The soma is the one that's going to take information, do something with it, and send it out. One other thing I did neglect to mention here, you can see I have neural fibrils. There's a network of threads that are going to come support in here our soma, and they're also going to go into the axon a little ways and support that axon, give it some framework. Think of them like 2x4s of a house. They're very small filamentous type threads that are going to support the whole cell, just like the 2x4s in our walls and the trusses in our roof. So that's the cell body. Our next slide, we're going to start talking about the processes that extend off of that cell body. Sometimes they're called nerve fibers, but they're extensions that come off. And we have two types. The first one's called the dendrite. The dendrite is the structure that brings information to the soma. Okay, whether that's from the brain and spinal cord on a motor nerve or from some sort of sensory information, we're going to generate an impulse, and that impulse is going to bring information down the dendrite to the soma. And our neurons typically have a lot of different dendrites. The more they have, the more information they can take in from various parts. They're typically not real long. And so they generate that initial electrical signal, carrying that electrical signal to the soma. Um, and so they're receiving information either from the brain, from the spinal cord, or in the case of sensory neuron, from our different receptors, chemoreceptors, taste receptors, light receptors, etc., etc. So that's the dendrite. The next one is, whoops, did I go the wrong direction? The next one is the axon. The axon is the structure that leaves the cell body, and we only have one axon per neuron. So that's this structure right down here. All of this is the neuron. I'll move this up a little bit so we can see it a little bit better. Okay, so here's our cell body right in here. Let me get my little clicker here. So there's the cell body or the soma. Here again are our dendrites. And then this is all the axon leaving, carrying information away from the cell body. And that's going to carry an electrical impulse, and that electrical impulse is going to be carried away from the cell body. Again, you can see some myelinated regions. Myelin is a lipid or a fatty type material, so you can see one there and one there. And then we have this area, the node of Ranvier, where there is no myelin. And again, remember, as that electrical signal comes down, that electrical signal is allowed to skip ahead to the nodes. And the more nodes that a neuron has, the faster that electrical signal is going to travel down. Um, One thing we do have, and so some of you probably say, well, I saw on some of the earlier pictures uh, that there was more than one axon. Well, we really don't have more than one axon. What we do have is what we call collaterals, branches that come off that one major axon. So here in this particular neuron that we saw in the opening of this segment, you can see an electrical impulse coming down right here. This is the one axon, and then we have collaterals branching off of that one axon. And a neuron can have many collaterals. And actually, the way things work in your brain, the more collaterals that you have, the more connections you make. So I think we've talked about over and over, you can automatically bring to mind what 1 plus 1 is. No problem. Or the color purple, no problem. Things that you've been learning from little on. Well, we have all kinds of connections, all kinds of collaterals coming off from the neurons in your brain, touching different dendrites of different neurons. And the more of those connections you have, the easier it is to remember something. And so you've repeated it, repeated it, repeated it, repeated it. It's now automatic. The same thing's true with any new information you learn. You begin to process that, and these little collaterals, terminal ends specifically, reach out and touch dendrites of other axons. Now, if you learn something wrong, whether it's information, academic type information, music information, art information, or athletic information, if you learn that information wrong, you're still going to perform that activity and do it. You need to now unlearn it, and it takes 11 times to do something the right way to negate the one time you did it the wrong way. So if we would just learn to do things the right way the first time, we would reinforce so many things that we learned so much quicker. But too often we don't do that and got to relearn it. One other piece of information coming off our axon at the tip here, and we talked about this during the muscular system, we have our synaptic knobs, sometimes referred to the terminal ends or axon terminals. We have lots of them here. And we like lots of them because those are the things that are going to reach out and touch other axons, touch other dendrites, I should say, and create what we call memories. And so we like to have lots of these. Sometimes we have tons of these, like when we talked about muscle control, we want to get more of a 1-to-1 ratio of a neuron and the synaptic end to a muscle cell. Sometimes we have a greater ratio of 1 to 100. So the more fine motor skill that you have, the better that ratio. The more gross motor movements, one neuron is going to control a whole bunch of muscle cells. So that's the axon. The collaterals, probably should have spelled that out for you. Let me try and spell that out for you on there. Collaterals. Wow, wasn't that terrible? Our next slide then on here is going to now talk about some of the axons in the central nervous system. We'll talk about this a little bit in greater detail in a later segment, in a later section of this chapter, but it's probably a good time to introduce it because we're going to start to talk a little bit more about myelin. In our central nervous system, that's in our brain and our spinal cord, our myelin, which is a lipid, is produced by a cell called the oligodendrocyte. Man, I couldn't get it out. Oligodendrocyte. And so this is the cell that's going to produce myelin, or this fatty substance, in the central nervous system and gives the whitish type appearance. And we'll see that a little bit more later when we start looking at the brain and spinal cord. But that's the white matter, this glossy myelin sheath produced by the oligodendrocyte in the central nervous system. In the peripheral nervous system, it's going to be made by a Schwann cell. And we'll talk about that on the upcoming slides here in a little bit. So again, bundles of myelin surrounding nerve fibers are going to make our white matter. That's going to be on the inside, the very inside of our brain, and we'll look at that a little bit later. So that myelin, or that lipid fatty substance, gives things a white glossy appearance. In contrast to that, in our central nervous system, you've probably heard many times the gray matter. This is the majority of your cerebrum, your cerebral cortex, what you think of. And so there's no myelin surrounding these axons or these nerve fibers in the central nervous system in your brain or spinal cord. In the brain, the gray matter is on the outside, and the spinal cord, it's on the inside. So we'll take a look at that more when we get to the brain and the spinal cord more specifically. So let's take a little closer look at this myelin. So we're going to talk about the peripheral nervous system here and the Schwann cell first specifically. So here you can see a Schwann cell. It's kind of wrapped around the outside of this axon. Okay. Probably can't make that a little bit bigger, but here's all the Schwann cell. And then you can see this Schwann cell has produced all of this lipid material, layer upon layer upon layer, wrapping around the axon, coating it in this lipid or myelin sheath, this fatty sheath, kind of protecting it, kind of acting as an insulator. So here you can see in a microscopic view, there's a neuron coming through here, and here's the myelin sheath. I probably shouldn't have drawn it quite that big. And here's another myelin sheath right here. And so in between, you can see that node of Ranvier. So an electrical signal can come down, skip ahead, and then skip ahead to the next node. And so on our next slide here, I kind of give a breakdown of the axon covering of this myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system. Some of our axons are quite large, quite big. They're surrounded by this myelin sheath. And again, the cell that produces that myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system is the Schwann cell. It's a glial cell, one of those support cells that we're going to talk more about in later segments. So again, this Schwann cell produces myelin. It's a lipid or a lipoprotein and gives a kind of whitish appearance to the axon. Note, the myelin is not on the soma. and it's not on the dendrites. We only find it on the axons. Okay, and so again, we have these little interruptions or little spaces. Those are called the nodes of Ranvier, and then we do have, the neural lemma, just like the sarcolemma. Um, that's just the cell membrane of the neuron, of that Schwann cell wrapping around, supporting that axon, and keeping the myelin sheath healthy. In smaller axons, so we're talking smaller neurons here, there is no myelin sheath. So there's no fatty material around it. It's unmyelinated. So again, think if it's myelinated, it's going to be white. If it's unmyelinated, it doesn't have any myelin, it's going to be gray. Okay? The Schwann cell is still going to be present. It's just not going to be producing the myelin. So I got 2 more slides here just to kind of depict this for you again. Here is the slide that we kind of saw earlier, the diagram we saw earlier. Again, the Schwann cell going all the way around the axon, and then the myelin sheath, that lipoprotein myelin surrounding the axon specifically, and the neural fibers. Here you can see a cross section. So here in the middle is the axon, and then you can see that myelin sheath right out here, how thick that fatty substance is. Down here, you can see an unmyelinated axon. So the Schwann cell. So here you can see the Schwann cell up here on this myelinated one kind of wrapping around. It's kind of in the purple. Here you can see the Schwann cell wrapping around this smaller axon. Again, no myelin sheath. So here's the myelin sheath. No myelin sheath down on this one. So white matter when we look at it in gross anatomy, gray matter when we look at it in gross anatomy. So just one more diagram then, just to kind of give you the picture, to compare the two side by side. So here's an axon, here's an axon, here's an axon, here's an axon. So we got 4 different axons from 4 different nerves here. And this single Schwann cell right here is sort of wrapping around all of them. Again, note, the Schwann cell is wrapped around it, but there's no myelin. Versus if we take a look over at this one, we take a look, wow, we take a look over at this cell over here, you can see the Schwann cell, again, wrapping around, and then inside the Schwann cell, producing this myelin sheath. So this one, white matter, this one, gray matter. And you'll get to see those a little bit more. Boy, I can't write very well with my mouse here. Gray matter, white matter, W. So that wraps up section 3 here of chapter 10 and the neuron structure.